right. Better get this adjusted so people can hear me.
Oh yes, raise it 2 feet, Mike. Be real.
That's where you gotta put it when you're 5'18". All right, well, good morning. As I always like to do, I'd like to just give a quick update about things that are going on at camp. Our summer is over. Our sessions ended on Friday, kids all went home, and that's all for our, if you will, direct ministry. And currently, I'm pretty sure they're probably all still there now, but at the end of the summer, our summer staff are invited to go on a rock climbing trip, or they go up to Devil's Lake and they go rock climbing together as kind of the last hurrah before people come back to camp, and then eventually they part ways and many are going back to home and where they have come from. So it's kind of a bittersweet time because it's good to kind of have finished our race, so to speak, but also it's hard to say goodbye to friends that are new, and I met a lot of fun and interesting people, and it's always fun to interact with young people and just to hear their stories and their struggles and why they're at camp. And many people this summer told me as I was talking to them, I probably only worked directly with maybe like 6 or 7 staff because facilities wise it's been kind of light as far as staffing goes. But they both, or the two that I can think of, kind of shared the same idea that both of them were convicted to come and work at camp. Despite it being a bad fiscal choice for them, they felt compelled to, they're like, I believe these things, I believe the gospel, I believe that sharing the gospel is important, and I think I feel like a hypocrite if I don't go and serve while I have this opportunity. And it's unique to hear young people speak that way and encouraging to hear them that way, and then to see them to serve and do the things that they did as counselors. So while our summer is over though, what I will say is that summer is a bit of a marathon. It starts in May and it gets busier in May, gets busier in June. It actually, for me, gets a little bit slower in July, but then the real uphill battle starts right now, actually last Saturday. So I say this I'm not looking for sympathy by any means, but I think I'm going on like day 15 of not having a day where I didn't work yet. Partial of that is just because of hay, but then we get into this part of the year where we have a lot of rental groups that come and they have ministry goals they want to meet and they need us to be available. So we do a lot of turnover. So summer ended for us on Friday, we cleaned up camp, and then Saturday morning, people come. And then they're here until Wednesday, and then they leave and another group comes Wednesday. So there's a lot of turnover like that, basically until the middle of August. So our staff, even though we are tired and we're starting to get short, there's still a lot of work to be done. So as we talk about personal problems, if you can just pray for strength and endurance and for us to lean on Christ-likeness to come forth from us as we are dealing with one another in our fatigue, and you can want to get snippy with people or comparing yourself, like, oh, you're not working as hard as me, like I'm bearing more load than you, that sort of thing would be not at Phantom Ranch, that we would see each other and the needs that we have and work together for the good of the ministry and for the good of our testimony to one another. This is just it's a trying time. August is a trying time. Summer doesn't officially end and we go back to our normally programmed schedule until after, I think Labor Day is the day in the end of summer, I'm pretty sure. I always get Labor Day and Memorial Day confused. Either one of them, we have groups that day, so for me, it doesn't make any difference as far as vacation goes. So just pray for us as we continue to march ahead through August, basically. But with that, this morning, I am excited to teach on the chapter that I told Daniel this, and I'm sorry, Daniel, I'm going to make you uncomfortable. I told Daniel that I said, I feel like of all of us, this chapter is about a journey across an ocean that goes sideways. And I am by no means an expert on anything maritime, but it is in one of my spheres of interest. So I spent some time looking over the shoulder of people, if you will, through the great world of YouTube, and people that are maritime things and ocean, and you realize most people, I'm not one of them because I've seen this, I don't think we realize how much the maritime industry impacts us every day. There's countless things in here that got to America on a ship. So I find the maritime industry interesting. This is obviously not modern maritime. This is old maritime. And this is a lot of sailing. So I'm going to do my best to speak on a topic that I am by no means an expert on. If you have actual sailing questions, talk to Daniel. And he can clarify and also correct anything factually that I am incorrect on, and I would be interested to learn more. So with that, we are going to follow Paul's journey on a boat. And when I first started studying through this, I was excited because I enjoy learning about history and about sailing, and all those things are really interesting. But I think there's a really good spiritual lesson that we can also learn. So I'm going to approach today from sort of a twofold. One, my study Bible made a point to bring out that this story is so factually, I'm trying to think how to put it. It's so factually, I guess we'll just use the word accurate, that the accounts of the things that happen in sailing, the description of the journey, it authenticates it by itself. Like this cannot be some made up trip. Like whoever did this, like this is a factual account of what happened. And I've often said, sometimes amongst believers, we sort of take for granted the authenticity of the Bible. We take it at face value because we've come to trust and believe it. But people from the outside looking in do not hold the Bible in the same esteem. And it's always fun to me to see areas of the Bible that speak truth that are outside of necessarily spiritual truth, that lend authenticity to the Bible, that make people want to pay attention to the other things that are spoken of. And this is one of those chapters. But with that, so I'd like to look at it from a factual standpoint, but then I think there's some great spiritual lessons we can learn from. I'm going to butcher it, and this is how I'm going to pronounce it, and if this is wrong, you can by all means tell me this is how you pronounce it wrong at the end. The Iroquilla is what the NASB uses to name the great wind that assails them, and ultimately the sideways adventure that they have in Paul's very long, drawn-out journey to Rome. So with that, what I would like to do first is I would like to read the whole chapter, as I always do. Then we'll go back through and we'll look at the maritime facts, and then I think towards the end, I can hopefully draw some spiritual analogies and conclusions on things that we can learn from Paul's trip. So if you would, turn with me to Acts 27, and then perhaps when we get done reading it, if you have it, I thought about it this morning, if there was ever a time for me to use the TV, putting this map up on there would have been it. But most people have maps in the back of their study Bibles, if you have one, that show Paul's journey to Rome. I would stick your finger in there also, because if you see the map, it'll make so much more sense as you look and you hear this account being read as we look it over. So, starting in verse 1, it says, When it was decided that we would sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. And embarking in the Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the regions along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea, accompanied by Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. The next day we put in at Sidon, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. From there we put out to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus, because the winds were contrary. Then, when we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Sicilia and Pamphylia, we landed at Myria in Lycia. There the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. When we had sailed slowly for a good many days, and with difficulty had arrived off Cnidus, since the wind did not permit us to go farther, we sailed under the shelter of Crete, off Salmon. And with difficulty sailing past it, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lycia. When considerable time had passed, and the voyage was now dangerous, since even the fast was already over, Paul began to admonish them, and said to them, Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. But the centurion was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. Because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, and the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there to somehow they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. When a moderate south wind came up, supposing that they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete, close inshore. But before very long, they were rushed down from the land a violent wind called the Euraquilla. And when the ship was caught in it, they could not face the wind. We gave way and let ourselves be driven along. Running under the shelter of a small island of Claudia, we were scarcely able to get the ship's boat under control. After they had hoisted it up, they used supporting cables in undergirding the ship, and fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Sistrus, they let down the sea anchor, and in this way let themselves be driven along. The next day we were being violently tossed. They began to jettison the cargo. On the third day we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our hands, since neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small storm was assailing us. From then on, all hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. When they had gone a long time without food, then Paul stood up in their midst and said, "Men, you ought to have followed my advice and not set sail from Crete, and incurred this damage and loss. Yet now I urge you to keep your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. From this very night, an angel of the Lord, of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, stood before me, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those who are sailing with you. Therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. But we must run aground on a certain island.' But when the 14th night came, and they were being driven about in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight the sailors began to surmise that they were approaching some land. They took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms, and a little farther on they took another sounding and found it to be 15 fathoms. Fearing they might run aground somewhere on the rocks, they cast 4 anchors from the stern and wished for daybreak. But as the sailors were trying to escape from the ship, and had let down the ship's boat into the sea, on the pretense of intending to lay out the anchors from the bow, Paul said to the centurion and to the soldiers, 'Unless these men remain in your ship, you yourselves cannot be saved.' When the sailors cut away the ropes of the ship's boat, they let it fall away. Until the day was about to dawn, Paul was encouraging them all to take food, saying, 'Today is the 14th day that you have been constantly watching and going without eating, having taken nothing. Therefore I encourage you to take some food, for this is for your preservation, for not a hair from your head or any of you will perish.' Having said this, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of all, and he broke and began to eat. All of them were encouraged, and they themselves also took food. All of us in the ship were 276 persons. When they had eaten enough, they began to lighten the ship by throwing out the wheat into the sea. When day came, they could not recognize the land, but they did observe a bay with a beach, and they resolved to drive the ship into it if they could. And casting off the anchors, they let them in the sea, while at the same time they were loosening the ropes of the rudders and hoisting the foresail to the wind. They were heading for the beach. But striking a reef where 2 seas meet, they ran the vessel aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern began to be broken up by the force of the waves. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, but none of them would swim, so that none would swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to bring Paul safely through, kept them from their intentions, and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land, and the rest should follow, some on planks and others on various things from the ship. And so it happened that they were all brought safely to land. So as you can imagine, if you were to go on a cruise ship, and that's how you got home, you might be a little upset with your cruise ship company. I know I certainly would be, because I'd like to be returned in the same way that I left. So what I would like to do is kind of go back through and sort of color in some of the details and the nautical history of this journey, and then kind of look at the map so that we understand, I think, better, at least I understood better as I went back through it, to really see how all these things kind of string together to make this trip be what it was. So starting in the first verse, when it was decided that we should sail for Italy, they proceeded to deliver Paul and some of the other prisoners to a centurion of the Augustan cohort named Julius. At first, I didn't think much of this, but what is a centurion? A centurion would be somebody that was a leader amongst soldiers. This was not just a nobody. I don't have time to go into all the details, but if you look up Roman centurion, you'll sort of see the rank or the process to which they achieved this rank. And typically, a cohort of men in the Roman army was 480 people. So this is not a nobody. But I think it's important that we remember the name Julius, because Julius comes up again in the text. So it kind of helps you when you hear like Julius did him a favor, you know who this man is. So this person had the job of taking soldiers and prisoners from the area of Jerusalem and Israel and getting them to Rome. And as a result of that, he obviously was responsible for requisitioning transport. And in the next verse it says, and embarking in an Adramyttian ship, which was about to sail to the region along the coast of Asia, we put out to sea, accompanied by Aristocrates, a Macedonian of Thessalonica. So we've talked about this the last time. I thought it was kind of funny as I was thinking about this last night, is that I had the privilege of speaking on Paul getting back to Israel, and then a whole bunch of stuff happened in Israel, and now I get to cover him leaving Israel. It just was sort of ironic in some ways. So we talked about this the last time on Paul's missionary journey. When we think of Asia, I'm going to hold this map up. It's not going to be that helpful, but it'll help me as I point. So when we think of Asia, we think of like China and Japan, like we think of the Orient. But at the time, Asia is Turkey. It's the area right above Israel. So they're going from here and they're sailing up along this coast. So originally they set out kind of backtracking in the same way that they came into Jerusalem. And I think that's important as we look at that, because it doesn't appear, at least in the other journeys that they did, that they liked to sail across the open ocean. They often kept close to shore. And I think part of that, if I remember right from the last time, is that there's trade that's happening. These ships aren't just taking people, but people are a cargo, a bonus cargo. They're really out there doing trade and moving things around, which we'll see here later that this Alexandrian ship was trying to get grain back to Rome. And we'll talk a little bit more about that specifically as we get closer and further on rather. The next day we put it outside, and Julius treated Paul with consideration and allowed him to go to his friends and receive care. If you look at the map, they've made it a little bit ways, like they're not actually that far outside of Israel at this point, and they pull in for a stop. And when I was thinking about this, you can kind of see that Paul was treated more or less throughout his imprisonment. He was a prisoner, but at the same time, he had not really received formal trial yet, and he was going to appeal his case to Caesar, so he was kind of held loosely. The centurion says, I have to get him there, but at the same time, he kind of wanted to go there, so Paul's is being a flight risk is sort of seen not as much as a flight risk, I guess. And I think that perhaps Paul's reputation of how he was acting for the last 3 years when he was in Roman custody probably added to his reputation of being somebody who's going to follow the rules and not make problems. But with that, if you think about it from Julius's perspective, yes, he's trusting Paul, but he's also sort of making Paul not his problem. So if you remember, we talked a lot about hospitality in the Middle East, specifically, well, it still goes on today, but specifically when we're talking about in the Bible and traveling, by Paul going to his friends and his friends caring for him, giving him food, putting him up, showing him hospitality, that is provisions that Julius didn't have to worry about getting for Paul and the people that were traveling with him. So it was a mutually beneficial arrangement. The next verse, it says, from there we put to sea and sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. We're going to talk a little bit more about sailing at the time, and this is where my understanding of sailing is somewhat limited. I have probably exactly, maybe 45 minutes of sailing experience on a very small sunfish that I went across the lake and back. Truthfully, I don't know how I did it, other than maybe just dumb luck, but anyways. So you can sail a boat against the wind, which in high school, we learned about this. I still remember because my physics teacher took a boat that had wheels and the sail, and then they put the fan, and then you like blow it against the wind, but you have to go at a certain angle to the wind, called tacking, in order to be able to sail into the wind. And we'll talk a little bit more about sailing technology. I think this is where my friend over there, if you really have questions about this, I have questions about it, so we'll ask him. But sailing technology was limited, actually more so by the sail shape, I think, than the understanding of sailing. And we'll see that as we continue on here. But they're having a hard time going against the wind, so they ended up trying to take shelter under cypress so that they're not having to deal with the wind. In the next verse, it says, when we had sailed through the sea along the coast of Celia and Pamphylia, we landed at Moriah and Lycia. So if you look at your maps, if you have them, they're sort of along the coast, the southern coast now, of what is nowadays Turkey, and they're stopping. And I'm assuming that this ship, there was a guy on there that was from Thessalonica, and Thessalonica is farther north. I'm wondering if that is where that ship was ultimately going, and that is why the Julius said, well, we got to find a way to get to Italy, which is much farther west from where they were. So in the next verse, it says, they found an Alexandrian ship sailing for Italy, and he put us aboard it. Now, if you look at your map, Italy, or Alexandria, is south. It's like down by Egypt, basically. So it's straight south of where they are. And I did a little bit of reading in my study Bible just about maritime history. Rome paid good money for ships to bring wheat and supplies to Rome. And because of that, ships would sail from around, and they would sort of get chartered, if you will, by the state to take journeys to bring food up there. So much so, I'm trying to remember the exact details. So this time of the year, which is probably the fall, is not a good sailing time, as we'll see later on. But in order to keep food flowing into Rome, they had basically loan forgiveness. If you took a loan to buy wheat and then you sailed that ship, the insurance was such that if you lost your cargo en route, that debt would be forgiven because you were trying to do it in the service of Rome. So there was a lot of financial incentive to make their way to Rome because they're going to make money on the wheat that they're selling. They're sailing with perhaps less financial risk. But you'll see later on that this lack of risk ended up with people taking more risky behavior, which we'll see later on as we look at the next couple verses where they decide to go when maybe they should have stayed. So we have a ship that has come from Egypt that is now straight north of where they are, and they get on it and they continue on sailing to Italy, to Rome. When we had slowly sailed for a good many days and with difficulty, we arrived at Cnidus. Since the wind did not permit us to go farther, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off of Salmone. And with difficulty, sailing past, we came to a place called Fair Havens, near which was the city of Lycia. So you can see that the weather has not really been in their favor. It says that they're making very slow progress, and the winds are starting to give them issue. And if you look again at that map, they sail underneath Crete. So I'm going to go off on a limb and say my understanding, at least at this time of the year, is most of the winds came out of the north, which is part of what they end up having a problem later with, is that if you have a wind out of the northwest, sailing to Phoenix gets hard because you're getting hit from the wind this way if you're looking at your map. And what ends up happening when they leave is they get hit with a wind out of the northeast, which basically drives them straight south to Africa, which is, we'll see later on what they're worried about. But one of the things that is challenging when you're on a sailboat, and this is where, again, I'm way off my expertise here. I remember once when we were on a boat somewhere on vacation, they talked about sailboats and how the Coast Guard, at least in America, if I'm remembering this right, they said all small boats have to have diesel engines. They have to have another means of propulsion other than just the wind. And when you think about it, if you are in a sailboat, you have to maneuver, but you have to maneuver using the wind. If you don't have wind, or you have wind that is not favorable, you're going to go in directions that you don't want to go, which could mean you crash into the land, or in modern times, if you think about it from a sailboat perspective and you're in a small area with a lot of boats, you have to try to maneuver with the wind, and if you can't, you're going to crash into other boats, or other boats are going to crash into you. So having another means to drive your boat was very important. And as you see here, they're having difficulty sailing their boat around Crete to try to get to Fair Havens. And one of the things that I think I have it more, we'll talk about it a little bit more specifically about the tacking problems, I think, in the next couple verses, but they were having trouble and they got to somewhere that was safe. I'm assuming they stayed there for a while, either to take on cargo, perhaps it was waiting for the weather to pass, but whatever happened, it says in the next verse that when considerable time had passed and the voyage was now dangerous, since the fast was over, Paul began to admonish them, and he said to them, Men, I perceive that the voyage will certainly be with damage and great loss, not only the cargo and the ship, but also of our lives. I'm not sure where Paul got this insight from. Perhaps it was from his travels in the past, that he'd been out to the ocean this time, but he knows that this is not a good time to be sailing. But as we talked about, with the financial incentives and the insurance that was issued, and for different reasons, the centurion, in the next verse, was more persuaded by the pilot and the captain of the ship than by what was being said by Paul. So the captain says, we're going, we got this, don't worry about it. The centurion, perhaps not knowing any better, said, okay, let's go along with it. What's funny about sometimes we can proclaim destruction to people. If you do that in your life, you're going to ruin it. And yet people will just continue to go along with the other voices. Just being weary of that, and at the same time recognizing that it's possible. In the next verse it says, because the harbor was not suitable for wintering, the majority reached a decision to put out to sea from there. If somehow they could reach Phoenix, the harbor of Crete, facing southwest and northwest, and spend the winter there. So, as I talked about before, if you have winds out of the north, they need a harbor, a safe harbor, to be able to put their boat. And if you think about the description that they said, southwest by northwest, so you have a harbor that is much more sheltered from those north winds, and they want to get over there. And the other reason that perhaps Fair Havens was not a good wintering harbor is that it was kind of a small place. This is just looking obviously outside. The Bible doesn't necessarily talk about this in scripture, but it was a small harbor and not really ideal for going and staying in this basically fishing village for the winter, kind of living off of these people and trying to do commerce. It wasn't ideal. So in the next verse, when we see that the south wind started blowing, and if you look where they are, there at the bottom of Fair Havens, the south wind would actually be quite favorable to kind of blow you up the coast to Phoenix. But, so they had a south wind, and it says that supposing they had attained their purpose, they weighed anchor and began sailing along Crete close inshore. So sometimes things happen, and you're like, all right, now's the time, let's go for it. But what happens? Paul ends up being right. In verse 14 it says, but before very long they were rushed down from the land, a violent wind called the Aquila, and when the ship was caught in it, they could not face the wind, and they gave way to it, and let ourselves be driven along. So the Aquila is just a name for a nor'easter, basically. So now you have wind that's coming across the island of Crete, basically blowing them away from the shore. You had wind out of the south, now it's coming out of the northeast. And they are trying to sail to the northwest. So this is obviously, from a sailing perspective, not ideal. And as you think about this idea, this is where I talk about tacking. So I did a little research on this, but my understanding is when you sail a boat into the wind, you have to sort of tack on an angle. So if the wind is going this way, you would sail this way, then you would sail this way, then you'd sail this way. Ultimately, you're going with the wind, or going into the wind is going this way, rather. You're going in the direction you want to go. But in a boat with a square sail, you have to make very steep angles to the wind. You have to be able to go far left and right to go in the direction that you want to go. And if you think about what's happening here when they're sailing along the land with a wind that is blowing against them. They have to be able to maneuver far to the left and far to the right. If you're boxed in by land and islands and coral and all these things, there's not a way to do that. So they basically gave up, and it says they let themselves be driven about by the wind. They gave way to the wind and let themselves go. And you can see that the wind is carrying them basically straight to the southwest now, because of the direction they're traveling southwest. And they end up going past a small island of Claude, where they have their ship's boat, so they're kind of like lifeboat, dinghy, landing craft behind them. They say, we better get this up here, otherwise we're going to lose it. I'm going to probably stop reading the verses just for the sake of time, but they bring the boat up onto shore before they get swept out to sea. In verse 17, it says that they were fearing that they might run aground on the shallows of Syrtis. They let down the sea anchor, and they let themselves be driven along. When I looked at that, if you look at your map, Syrtis is actually on the north coast of Africa. So they're at Crete. I'm going to do it backwards. So Crete is here. They're worried that they're going to basically be driven across the open ocean into the shallows, like on the other side of the ocean. So you can imagine they must have been booking with the wind. And this area is actually, outside of the Bible, just in maritime history, is rather famous for shipwrecks, and whole fleets have gotten stuck there. And what happened is there's these giant sandbars out in that area, and boats would get stuck in the sandbars. But then if you remember at the beach, when you have big waves come, those waves like build and they like come up and over. So you'll have boats that get stuck, and then those waves would be coming up behind them and basically just obliterate these boats. And they didn't want that to happen to them for obvious reasons. So they drop the sea anchor, they try to slow themselves down and just get taken about by the wind. And then it says in verse 18 that the next day there was a violent storm that began to just tossing them about for 14 days. They are stuck in this giant storm in the middle of the ocean, trying to figure out where they are. In verse 20 it says, there's neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and this was no small storm that was assailing us. And from then, hope of our being saved was gradually abandoned. So after weeks of being tossed about in the ocean, not knowing where they are or where they're going to end up, I think they just kind of slowly resigned themselves to their demise. But this is where it's interesting, the spiritual, aspiritual lesson is that oftentimes God does not bring us to the end of ourselves quickly. It's often a slow, gradual demise until eventually they slowly just come to terms. We come to terms with whatever it is that we are facing in life before we stop and we fall to our knees and we call to God, and God answers. And you'll see in the next verse with Paul that he kind of gets them in verse 21. He says, guys, remember how I told you it was a bad idea to leave? Look who was right. And I don't know if he did that out of a sort of an arrogance, or perhaps it was, so the next thing I'm about to tell you, maybe you should listen to me. And what does he say in the next verse? He says, I urge you to keep up your courage, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only the ship. He says, for this very night, an angel of God, to whom I belong and whom I serve before me, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must stand before Caesar, and behold, God has granted you all those that are with you. And then the next verse he says, therefore, keep up your courage, men, for I believe God that it will turn out exactly as I have been told. I was thinking about the other times in the Bible where it talks about faith. There's that same phrase of, and he believed God and it was a credit to him for righteousness. It talks about that with Abraham when he says, you're an old man. He reasons himself, I'm an old man, my wife is old, there's no way I can have kids, but God says I'm going to be the father of many nations. I believe it, we're going to do it. And if you kind of think about Paul's situation here, days, weeks into being tossed about in the ocean, God says, don't worry, you're not going to die, even though everybody thinks you're going to die. And it just says, for I believe God, that it will turn out exactly as he said it will. And just that trusting is faith. Like, it's such a great illustration of what faith is. But Paul remembered that he was on a mission and that God was going to deliver him. And next it says, "But we must run aground on a certain island." So when the 14th night came, and they had been driven along in the Adriatic Sea, it's dark outside. The sailors start to realize that, hey, we're probably gonna, for whatever reason, something in them says we're getting close to land. I don't know if that's a sailor sense. I know I wouldn't have that. I'd be like, I don't know, we're in the middle of the ocean. Boom. What did we just hit? I don't know. But they figured out that they were getting close to land. And because of that, it says that they were taking readings of the water, and the water's getting shallower and shallower and shallower, and they say, we better stop. So they throw 4 anchors behind the boat to stop and wait for the light to come. I was thinking about times in life where we are in trials and dealing with things. Sometimes the best thing we can do is hurry up and wait, and stop and pause and wait for more illumination of what is to be the next step. They didn't know where they were going. They could have been heading into a soft landing on a beach with restaurants and hotels and all this stuff. But it was dark outside. They had no idea. Sometimes, with lack of other information, it's time to stop, wait, and wait for the light to come. And I would encourage you that when we are faced with the storms of life, that perhaps that should be your next course of action. Sometimes we don't need to hurry up and do something. Sometimes we just need to stop. There's the adage, if you get lost in the woods, what's the first thing you should do? Sit down. Why? Because if you keep wandering around trying to figure out where you are, you're probably going to make yourself more lost. So just stop, pause, gather information, and relax. And it looks like I'm going to run out of time. But there's a couple things that I'll just talk about sort of briefly off the top of my head, because I'm going to end up running out of time. You'll see later on that even amongst all these things, you have these guys that are trying really hard to sail, and so much so that they're not taking care of themselves. It says that they hadn't eaten for 14 days. Now, part of that, I think, was probably they were busy trying not to wreck the ship. Part of that is, I can only imagine after 14 days being violently assailed in a storm, that hunger might be the last thing from your mind. People probably hopelessly seasick. But Paul says, look, we need to stop. This is going to be for your benefit. And he stops, even amongst the storm, prays, gives thanks, and they break bread and they eat it. And one of the small lessons that I think we can get caught up in the desire to live a life that is selfless, we often will neglect self. And there's a time and a place where I'm going to use the word self-care is very important. This is a lesson that is reiterated in the fire service. We talk about this sometimes, like if your safety is first. And you will think, but that just seems so selfish. But the instructors were always quick to point out, if you get hurt, who are you helping? Now somebody has to help you. Not only are you not a part of the solution, you are now a part of the problem. And sometimes we have to be careful that we balance taking care of ourselves so that we can take care of others. And an analogy, I'm sure everybody's heard this, if you're paying attention, as you should be, on the pre-flight briefings on airplanes, they always tell you, in the event the oxygen mask deploys, put yours on first, then help the kids that are with you. And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. If you fumble and you can't get the mask on your kid, and then you pass out because there's not enough oxygen, now your kid doesn't have a mask on, and neither do you. You haven't actually helped anybody. But if you help yourself first, then you can assure that those that need help can be helped because you took care of yourself. So my encouragement is, when things are crazy, don't forget we need to take care of ourselves. But for the sake of time, we see that in the end, even though it was a wild ride, that the last verse says, and they all made it safely to shore. As it happened, they were all brought safely to land. Now, I'm sure that is not how anybody anticipated that this trip was going to go. They probably thought they were going to safely arrive in Rome, except for Paul, because he knew better. But we see that God was faithful. And as I was thinking about the Aquila, I guess I'll end with these thoughts quickly. When we are faced with the storms that inevitably come in life. I'm just going to read what I have. Rest assured that things might look okay for a while and smooth sailing in life. Eventually, the storm of life will come, and they will blow hard. We may be blown off course, turned upside down. Eventually, we may gradually lose hope, knowing that we eventually will wreck on something. In those times, will we remember the message that God has given us? Will we remember the promises and the callings that He has placed in our lives? Will we take the time to drop anchor, give thanks, do self-care, wait for the light to come to show us the next step? Will we then weigh anchor and move with confidence ahead on the path that seems to be laid out? We missed it, but they basically say, all right, there's the beach. They cut the ropes and they fully commit to it right before they crash into the reef. Will we do the same thing? Will we move forward when we have this next plan? Or will we panic when things are unforeseen, get in our way, and hold us back? Or we will struggle on, even if that means getting where we are going, soaking wet, exhausted, and clinging to the remnants of our well-made plans. Life is going to get bumpy. There will be waves, and there will be difficulties. And as I was thinking about Paul, I think when we think about the promise that brought Paul through to the end, it's easy to think about the promises that you are going to be of good cheer, you're going to be my witness in Rome. I'm sure thought that was exactly what Paul's thought when he's clinging to a piece of wood and swimming to shore. Yeah, be of good cheer, God, this is funny. I don't think that was the promise that kept Paul going. I think that the promise that kept Paul going is the same promise that can keep us going. And it comes from 2 Timothy 1:12. Paul, talking about his own life, he says, "For this reason I also suffer these things, but I am not ashamed. For I know whom I have believed, and I am convinced that He is able to guard what I have entrusted Him until that day." And as we are faced with our own Iraquillas in life, I want to encourage myself and you that God has given us promises that we can trust in. God did not promise Paul a smooth sail to Rome. He promised that he would get there, and he did. Even though I'm sure that was not, well, actually, truthfully, if you're Paul, this is probably what you would come to expect. I don't think he ever really had those first-class accommodations. Everything always seemed to go sideways in Paul's life. And yet, being sideways, he still made it exactly where he was supposed to go. And I think it should be a great encouragement to us that while we may not have the exact same calling as Paul and we're not living the same life, we do serve the same God. And we have entrusted the same things to Him. And He is able to keep them until that day. So hopefully, next time you read this account and you hear about the storms of Paul, you can remember that we can take courage in storms as well because of God and because ultimately of the work of Jesus Christ. So, sorry I went over on time. I always over-prepare, but it's a lot of fun to write these. So, with that, let's pray. Heavenly Father, I thank You for this account of Paul's trip to Rome. I thank You, Lord, that even though it was bumpy, that he learned from it, that we can learn from it, and Lord, that we can see that You are faithful and You are good, and constantly be reminded of that as we study Your word. And Lord, I just ask that You help us in storms of our own lives, that we would trust You, knowing that You are able to keep what we've entrusted until that day. And I just pray these things in Your Son's holy and precious name. Amen.